Appreciate everybody's conversation. Angela, we've had a little bit of this conversation in the past. So I'm glad I had the chance to hear all of that because it gives some context to sort of where we are. So my name's Kevin Walker. I am here at the behest of the Housing and Building Association, which is here in Colorado Springs, one of the larger professional organizations, trade organizations, and we were asked a year ago or so to see if we could put together some stuff. I've known Sarah for a very long time, been involved in, and when I did the Leadership Pikes Peak class, it was called Pikes Peak 2000, so that tells you a little bit when, when I did it. I think I graduated in 1988 for that, but I learned a lot of lessons in that year, and a lot of them still illuminate what I do today. So I've been here in Colorado Springs for 45 years. Came straight out of college as a city planner, and then have wound my way through the development business ever since. And I have been a past president of the HBA, and I have a master's degree in city planning. So my approach to this, I have a degree in geography, so I kind of look at things, why they are there, what they're doing there, that kind of thing. HBA is like I said, a 501c6, a nonprofit trade association, basically representing the building and housing industry in Colorado Springs. We have a couple of different spin-off groups. HBA Cares is a philanthropic group that does a lot of modifications to houses and those sorts of things, and so we work with them as well. They're a spin-off group. And Careers in Construction, where we're trying to get, I think we started 4 or 5 years ago, now have basically shop class in 40 or 50 high schools now in the state. So that's been a tremendous success. Like I said, my name's Kevin Walker. I am currently the president of WSDM District Managers. We manage 50 metropolitan districts here in Colorado Springs, fire districts, some water districts, all sorts of different districts. So if you have any specific questions about districts, though I don't get into that a whole lot here, I'm happy to answer any of those. As I said, I've been in here 45 years. I've worked for some of the major developers. I've been involved in some of the large community development projects in El Paso County, Northgate. My first big job was to annex the Northgate project, which is now almost built out. It's where basically along I-25 between Northgate and Interquest. I've worked for the Olive Company who developed that. I worked for Norwood Development and did a project down in Fountain and worked with their company for a long time. I've worked with Lennar, which is a national home builder. I've done my own development a couple of times and survived 4 recessions. Sometimes I think it's 5, but anyway, 4 of the recessions that have come through here. As you know, housing and building is a boom and bust business. So I've modified this a little bit. What I want to do really is to give you some idea what goes into the developer's process, about why he or she does what they do, and how they do it, sort of behind the scenes kind of information. But before we do that, just to break the ice a little bit, is there anything anybody wants to know about developers or anything they want to say? Because I have hardly ever not found somebody who wants to say something to a developer. Yes, ma'am.
What is WSDM?
WSDM, Walker Schooler District Managers. Terry Schooler was my partner. And so that's what the WSDM is for. But we don't call ourselves Walker Schooler anymore because everybody thought we managed school districts. Mm-hmm. And so I quit that. We quit that fairly quickly. Anyway, as you think about this, developers they're usually the bad guys in Perry Mason and all of the other projects. My wife and I always laugh about that. So, oh, it's a developer who's killed the guy, right? So anyway, if you have any questions about who developers are, hopefully you'll get to that a little bit in here. But don't be afraid to ask.
I grew up on Scooby-Doo, so.
Scooby-Doo? There's always developers in Scooby-Doo, mostly mining, right? They're always trying to mine the jungle or whatever. I don't know. So they're developers too, I guess. So what I want to cover is the process and the motives of the developers, the entitlement process, a flow chart. We'll do a little bit of trivia. I'll ask you some questions, maybe help you learn a little bit. Some positive and negative aspects of the process. Have you guys gotten the sort of lowdown on the development process at the city or at the county? Have you had that class yet? Yeah, okay, so planning came? Okay. So this is the stuff that they don't, that's not theirs. So I'm not going to spend the time on the zoning and all that kind of stuff. What I'm trying to do is give you the background for why this can become contentious at times. And then take some questions and comments as we get to the end. So what does the development process look like for a project? You've covered the planning process. That's the process, though, that starts with the developer's application. So what I want to try and do is give you a little background as to how they got to the application. What is it they're trying to do, and why are they having to go through this process? And it's an involved process. So before you even hear or know about something that's going on, the developer's been at this sometimes for years, sometimes for months, but has spent a lot of money and spent a lot of time, and that's what I want to kind of give you a flavor for. Did I just turn that off? So who are these developers? I've spent 45 years dealing with them and being one. And so this is kind of just to give you an idea. Most of them are very entrepreneurial. They're fast decision makers. They jump across cliffs. I mean, I always used to use this analogy of city planners used to, they like to, if there's ever a gap that they have to jump across, you always like to close that as much as you can so your foot can't fit in it. And the developers always like to jump before they even know how far it is. And so it's a bit of a, it's a personality type that people are willing to take risks and, move things forward and try to accomplish stuff, even if they can't figure out how to get from here to there. Some of them are corporate. You get very corporate developers. A lot of the big builders, the national builders, are very corporate in their approach. Then you have the guys that are just one-offs, and they buy a piece of land and they try to figure out how to do it from there. Or they've had some experience. They're realtors or they're engineers. Engineers don't usually make good developers, but sometimes. And so there's no one skill set. Developers are always trained in this. I've known attorneys, I've known accountants, I've known realtors, I've known planners. That's me. Some of them are easily identified. Some of them like to be in front of you all and like to talk about it, like to have their name and everything. Some of them are not. Some of them hide behind their staffs. Some of them try to hide behind as many things as they can possibly hide behind so that you don't know where they live. And so it's, there's just all kinds of different personality types. Some of them overanalyze. Some of them use just their gut. We can name names if we need to. Some of them spend all kinds of time and they never pull the trigger. And those are the ones you don't hear about very often. The ones you get in a lot of trouble are the ones that jump before they even know what the heck they're doing. Right? And Colorado Springs developers and builders are very locally based. So that's a big difference in Colorado Springs than it is in a lot of other places. If you go to Denver, there are a lot of major developers there, but big corporate developers are in Denver and all of the other communities. Colorado Springs is an amazing place relative to who the developers are and the builders. They're very locally based. Every cycle you get through, you get the Lennars or builders like that. But most of the time you're dealing with local builders, Classic Homes or Norwood or Banning Lewis Ranch and those kinds of folks, Oakwood, all kind of local folks. So it's the reason for that is because Colorado Springs was surrounded by a whole lot of large ranches, and those large ranches were purchased by local folks, and those local folks were controlling that and saw the opportunities and built those things from scratch. So you didn't get very large developers. Ford Aerospace did a lot of development up along Interquest. That was the only kind of corporate developer that I remember having a large presence. I got to get that thumb off of there. How do they get from here to there to a development? So a lot of them have an idea. Most of them already know who they are. They already know what they do. They develop drugstores or they develop burger joints. There's a lot of dang burger joints running around out there. this time. They do convenience stores, they do Walgreens, they do residential development, they do multifamily. So they kind of know what they do, and they look for places to do that business. So they'll do market studies, some of them, find the holes in the market. Seems to me like the convenience stores, the Mavericks, and those kind of folks come and go. They look for where the other guys already are and go there. I don't know why that is, but some kind of business model that seems to work for them. But they'll do a lot, sometimes they'll do a lot of market study, try to find out where the uses are and see kind of where they want to go with those things. Real estate brokers are always marketing sites, so they have a listing on the site on the corner, and they're out looking for people to put a convenience store or some other multifamily or something like that. So the marketing, the real estate brokers will also influence what goes on. And once they make a general decision, they say, I think I want to own that 1,000 acres and develop it into a major community development, or I want to buy that 1 acre and put a Walgreens on it. Then you start really getting into the details. They'll do a lot of studies, traffic counts, access points, soil studies, utility studies, try to figure out if the site's going to work for their particular use. They'll analyze the competition and make sure that the site fits on that. They'll do concept sketches and all kinds of different things. So they spend time and money doing that, and they'll do that on, maybe half a dozen sites, a dozen sites, and maybe one of them will work. So there's a lot of money spent that doesn't get to the finish line in the development business. And then one of the critical things is once they've decided sort of this is where I want to go, then they negotiate a price. So the price is one of the very first things that occurs in a developer. They agree to pay this much money for that particular site, whether it's 1,000 acres, whether they're paying $5,000 an acre, or if it's $25 a foot for this site that's right out here over at Wasatch and whatever. And so they negotiate a price. That's one of the problems that occurs in this process, is that the price is kind of already fixed when they start the process of going down the road to talk to neighborhoods and or planners and the planning process. So they kind of know what the general price is. They put it in there, they figure it out, they do pro formas, they try to figure out what risks they're going to take and whether they can get it done. And then they hire the planning department, or they hire the planning staff or the planning consultants to make a submittal to the planning departments and the engineers, and they do the plats and they figure out, do the detailed drawings. But that price is already set. That'll come into play here obviously later. And that's where the public then starts to interact with this. So the point of that whole exercise is to give you a flavor for when you all see something, or when it comes to fruition, there's a lot of work that's already been done, and a lot of money spent, and a lot of time spent. And so when people start to mutter about it and talk about it and maybe don't like it quite so much, or yell and scream about it even, the tension that occurs is partially because they spent a lot of time thinking about this and a lot of money trying to figure out where to go with this. And you all are seeing it for the very first time. And so you all have to figure that out. But it's just a problem with the process. I'm not trying to say it's right, wrong, or indifferent. Doesn't say that you can't change all of that, because prices do change at times and projects don't get to fruition. But it's if you all are neighborhood activists and you're getting involved in the development process, you just need to recognize that there's a situation there that maybe you haven't thought about. Yes, ma'am.
That makes me have a question in relation to your, do you not want to ask questions?
That's right.
The evil developer. I think the evil comes from these people are just motivated by money and aren't thinking about the neighborhood and the impact or all these different considerations.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to that?
I would say, yeah, if they are motivated by money. That's kind of the whole point. You don't invest thousands and thousands and sometimes millions of dollars in order to not make money on that. So yeah, it's a profit-based business, to be sure. And sometimes those profits are big, and sometimes they're non-existent. And so you get to the point. But yeah, especially in those infill type situations, you try to talk to the planning department. You may live in the town. You may get a sense of, oh boy, this is going to be a problem, or when I knock down that building and put up a different building, what's going to happen there, and can I make it fit? I think that responsible developers will try to think their way through that at the beginning, but they don't know until they get into this development process, until the neighborhood gets to talking to them. And then you can start to maneuver some of the things. You can change the lighting plan, you can move the parking lot, you can landscape a little bit more and try and help that situation, or you can just say, no, I'm not going to do it. And that's where the real arguments start. And the zoning code has a lot of guidance for that. So nobody wants to spend all this money we were just talking about and then submit your plan and have the planning department say, well, this doesn't even meet the setbacks. There's not enough landscaping, you don't have enough parking. So the zoning code is sort of the preliminary question about, can I get it to fit in the neighborhood? What are the things that people are worrying about? Is it that setback? Is it the number of trees? Is it the landscaping? Is it the lighting? Is it the height of the building? Heights of buildings are a big deal, especially when you're trying to fit into a Colorado Springs neighborhood, which doesn't usually have a lot of height to it. So it's a good question, and so once you've made the submittal is kind of when people start to react and say, well, this doesn't fit into my neighborhood. This is not going to work. But it could work if you would move that light standard and put it over there so the light shines down instead of up in the air or right in my window or something, or things like that. So there are some manipulations you can do once you get into that process. Oh, yeah.
How often would you say developers actually reach out and talk to the community first before they go into all the planning, all the money, all that? Because it seems like the contention happens like once they've invested all of that.
No,
Does anyone ever talk to the local community, the neighbors first before they dive that far deep in?
It happens, especially if you can identify. And your organization used to be one that you could talk to a neighborhood association. Mm-hmm. If you could identify those people and you can talk to them, you can have sort of the beginning of that dialogue. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of time though, and almost the very first question is, well, what does it look like? And so you got to put pencil to paper, or else people can't really visualize what it is that you want to talk about. Mm-hmm. I can talk about a Walgreens being located there, but it's like, well, how does it fit on that site? I mean, what kind of landscaping can you do? That kind of thing. So I think that it happens. I think that a lot of developers, though, will sort of think that they already know, and they kind of know what's going to happen, and they hire a planning consultant who can give them some advice about that. And then some of them know that they're going to have trouble and submit it anyway, and just kind of see if they can get through the fight and the argument.
Can you define plat, what exactly that means?
Yep, okay, yeah, sure. A plat, okay, so I'll just go through this real quick. Rezoning is what the use of the property is. Is it office, is it apartment, is it high-rise, is it a commercial site? That's what the rezoning is. So it's basically a land use, and then what it looks like. So landscape setbacks and parking and all those kinds of things are in your zoning code. The development plan gives you puts very specific lines on a plan, shows you where the grading is going to be, so how much you're going to cut the site or raise the site, how high the building is going to be, where the parking lot is, where the landscaping is, all that kind of stuff. That's a very detailed plan. The plat is a legal document that basically says it's a subdivision. Basically, it says this used to be Lot 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in East Side Subdivision 21, and now it's going to be Lot 1, Walgreens Subdivision Number 1. And so it's just basically the legal document. And in that, though, there are specific things that you got to do. You got to give the city a drainage report. You got to give them, extra right-of-way if they need room for a turn lane, or you have to provide easements if there's utilities on the site. And that's what the legal document, that's what the plat is. So it's a very technical highly legal sort of piece of paper. And then the building permit obviously is, once you've gotten past all of that, it's just, will the building stand up? You know, what's the foundation look like? You know, that kind of thing. And, you know, what's your HVAC system going to look like, and very specifics. So these are the places really where the discussion comes in. In those two, did I just do that?
I think if you, yeah.
Oh, look at that. Who says I'm not high tech? And so, like I said, there, the majority of the processes start in this rezoning and development plan kind of phase. So this is the land development chart. Just a little bit about what I've been talking about. You option to purchase the land, so you got the price. You go through the entitlement. That's the zoning. That's the development plan. Those kinds of things. Then you can get a building permit. Then you build infrastructure, build pipes, water lines, streets. You know, 95% of the development that occurs in Colorado Springs and El Paso County is what we call greenfield development. It's not trying to fit itself into an existing neighborhood. It's actually creating the neighborhood. It's building the main streets. It's building the roads. It's building the lots, the parks, the school sites, all that kind of stuff. So the majority of development that occurs in El Paso County and in City of Colorado Springs is that large-scale greenfield development. And the ones you hear about in the newspaper, the ones that get on the front page, are the ones that are in what we call infill development. And those are the ones that are trying to fit an apartment complex onto an old office building site, you know, that sort of thing. Or building a Walgreens in a situation where there were some houses there or something. So that's called infill. Let's see, what else did I say? Most applications go through the controversy. 95% of those is kind of there's hardly any problem. Most of the developers and the engineers know what to do. They submit plans to the city reviews them, makes whatever changes they need to make. They go through and get approved, and then the lots and those kinds of things get built. It's not as simple as that. You know, if you start with a raw piece of land, say out on Powers Boulevard or on Mark Shuffle now, I guess it used to be Powers. There's no vacant land on Powers anymore, I guess. But if you're out on Mark Shuffle or something like that, it can take up to 2 years from the first idea you have, the first time you have control of your plan or your dirt, to get to a finished lot. So it takes a long time to get through that. It takes time to develop your plans. It takes time for the city to review them and then go back and forth with different kinds of things. And then finally get somebody to build the lots, the curb and gutter and the sidewalks and all that kind of stuff. It's a problem. It's one of the biggest issues around affordable housing in El Paso County and actually around the country, is that this entitlement process takes a very long time. And so from idea to the time you start to think you have an idea, you get 2 years worth of federal government changes and Ukraine and bond pricing and all kinds of different things you have to deal with in terms of if you're making a long-term investment. Before you see a nickel, you're out 2 years and millions of dollars sometimes. So it's a risky business. When they start the process, they notify adjoining and nearby owners and neighborhood associations. Some of you have seen these green mailers. I think Kono even does those for the city. And so there's a little bit of that that goes on. You'll get notification. Developer submits the plans. They process various reports, traffic reports, soils reports, site plans, drainage reports, utility reports, all those kinds of things that they have to submit to the city in order to have them reviewed. And neighborhoods and owners then have the opportunity to discuss and comment. So again, it's one of those, I don't know quite how to change that process, because most of the time you can't really have a legitimate discussion about what you're trying to do until people know what it is you're trying to propose. But at the same time, it'd be great if you could, who's that? You wanted to, could you go to the neighborhood and just sort of chat about that, maybe get some ideas? It can add time, but it can also talk you out of buying that piece of property too. So you may not make a mistake that way. Sometimes the neighborhood meetings recommended by the planner and conducted by the applicant or the planning department. The interesting piece about this is, like I've talked about, the developer at this point has managed all of his own risk. His is his idea, it's his money. He's got control of the process. He can decide whether it looks like this or looks like that, or if it's red or green, or if I want to do housing, or if I want to do a multifamily, or kind of what I want to do. But when he goes and steps into the neighborhood, then you all get the chance. The public gets the chance to say what they think about this idea. And so there's a lot of difference. That's a major change for someone who's spent sometimes, months and years and millions of dollars to try and get from here to there. Now has to put themselves out to neighborhood ideas and other people's ideas about these things. Some of those ideas are good, and some of them you can work with. Some of them are not. Some of them are just it's been a park, it's been an open space. I don't want anybody to build on it, and I'm just whatever you're proposing, I don't care. I'm not going to like it, and those are very difficult things for them to do because it's private property. They've spent the money. They have the right to do it on the zoning. So you kind of have to watch those things. If you really want to make an effect on the property, you want to limit yourself to things like what the lights look like, where's the parking lot, how high is the building, how many units are there, how much traffic is coming out of there. Those kinds of arguments are things that the developer can maybe have some room to maneuver and work with, but no, you're not going to do this is not usually a very viable argument and doesn't lead to a lot of good discussion. It leads to a lot of fighting at city council is what it leads to. So this is a little break. How many residential units are there in El Paso County? Any idea?
Single family or apartment?
All units, all housing units. Empty, vacant, full.
The number out there, it's not coming to
310,000. Seems like a lot. Yeah, but if you add it up, 2.1, 2.2 people, 750,000 people, divide that, it's kind of that's the number. There's a lot of housing out there, or a lot of money and a lot of public time is spent on housing that is rent managed or rent controlled or income qualified. How many units do you think there are out there of that? Yeah, 12 to 15,000. It's like 3 to 4% of the total. So the idea here is that there's 95% or more of the housing units in El Paso County are on the private market, not in a rent-controlled housing authority Section 8 kind of setting. So that's just an interesting comment. I'm on the El Paso County Housing Authority, and it just always gives you perspective because there's a lot of money spent and a lot of time spent on these low income or senior or other kinds of rent managed developments. A lot of light and a lot of heat, but in the end, it doesn't move the needle as much as you think it does, and so it's kind of interesting. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any idea how that percentage compares with other cities of comparable size?
Yeah, it's much lower. Yeah, we haven't been in the business planning. Colorado Springs and El Paso County have not really been in the business of trying to build that kind of housing. I don't know if you've had the chance to speak to Steve, who's the housing officer.
Yeah,
Steve, he came about 10 years ago, and that world changed fast. And he's done a fabulous job of driving more of those kinds of projects, obtaining the funding, getting the city to support that kind of thing, and the county. And he's done a great job of really starting to drive that a little bit more. So, but I think we're way behind the curve, and from a percentage of that.
Are you saying like Section 8 type housing that is only, or are you saying
Yeah.
rentals total in general?
No, I'm talking about Section 8 and those that are income qualified. So if you earn 30% of, where they try to restrict the rent you have to pay to 30% of what you
Right.
earn, which may be very little. And so, those kinds of projects are getting built more and more, but there's not very many of them, even though there's a lot of money and time spent on them and city resources.
Does it have to do with politics at all?
Oh, yeah, sure.
You're very
Sure.
conservative.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I'm not conservative, but I
Ab-
live in a
no.
conservative community.
Absolutely.
So it's
Absolutely.
really
Yeah.
directly tied to that.
And you even heard Mayor Suthers say, the city is not in the business of providing housing. He said that.
Some people will really
And now, he's the same guy that hired Steve, God, what is his last name? Posey. That's it. Yeah, Steve Posey. You're a winner.
And who was Steve Posey?
Steve Posey's the housing officer for the city. John Suthers hired him, so I mean he says that, but not really. He was a public safety kind of guy. That's all. So how many units do economists say we are short from the Great Recession? So basically, everybody stopped building in 2008, and this is a phenomenon around the country. So around the country, they talk about being 5 million units short. In El Paso County, we're 12 to 15,000 units short because of the people who've moved in and the households that have been formed. We didn't keep up in 2010, 11, 12, 13. We're trying to catch up now because they've built a lot of apartments in the last few years. So some of that gap's starting to get closed. But almost every community in the United States suffers from this gap that is a result of the 2008 recession. And that's part of the reason why we have a housing crisis, because we just never built them. And because of that, 95% of them operate in a market environment. You have a shortage of housing, the prices go up. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And so people say you can't build your way out of this problem. My contention is that's the only way you're going to get out of this problem, is you got to build houses. So anyway, just a little fun facts. So this is where the conflict is. There have been a lot of things happen before. We talk about density, building location. What happens when things go negatively at neighborhood meeting steps? Sometimes the developer's a jerk, won't change anything, won't listen, really doesn't want to do this, doesn't want to talk to neighborhoods, doesn't want to listen, doesn't want to be part of the neighborhood. It's like, I follow the rules, I spent my money, approved my plans. That's not everybody, that's a few, but mostly people are trying to figure out how to get their plans approved and what kind of reasonable accommodations they can make. But they do go bad, and there's a couple out there, some have even been subject of some recent lawsuits where the city council has approved plans and somebody sues because they didn't think the sound or noise was taken quite into effect. That's the amphitheater up in Northgate is an example of that. People have sued about the old 2424 out on Garden of the Gods because of fears of getting out in a wildfire setting, those kinds of things. So, there are times when you just cannot come to any kind of agreement, and the city council has to decide, and then the courts get to decide. So that happens every so often. We've had some recent ones: the Launchpad, Royal Pines, Creek Walk. Launchpad has been approved. Creek Walk was approved. Both of them, I think, have been subject of lawsuits and stopping the development at this point. Royal Pines is still going through. It's a rent controlled, not rent controlled, but I keep income subsidized housing project up in Briargate, and those folks just are not taken very kindly to that. So this is one of those. It doesn't matter whether the density is reduced by 20 units or 40 units or 50 units. They just don't want that use in that location. End of discussion. And they'll either win or lose at city council, and then that will probably end up in court as well. The courts, by the way, have almost always sided with the city council. So city council the legislative body has tremendous leeway in the planning world, in the zoning world, in the legal world, to weigh the evidence, and courts are very reluctant to say that they know better than you about whether that's a proper use, or there's too much traffic or not enough traffic or whatever. And so it's the courts have given a lot of leeway to city councils and county commissioners when they're acting in a proper legislative way. Yes, ma'am.
It sounds vaguely familiar, but where's Launchpad at?
Launchpad's the one that's over there on 19th and Uinta. It's the youth homeless kind of housing thing, right next to Ruth Washburn, where my grandkids are going to school, and my kids went to school.
What's Creek Walk?
Creek Walk is a 6 or 7 story apartment building down on South Nevada, between Nevada and Tejon, in that redevelopment area where Sprouts and some of the other redevelopment stuff has occurred, and that was just recently approved, and then somebody filed a lawsuit about that. So we'll see.
Lawsuit for, do you know?
Yeah, to say that the city council didn't properly. Didn't read it, but I think it's because city council didn't properly weigh the evidence that there was going to be a problem with, I think, evacuation in a wildfire situation.
Yeah, that's what the newspaper said.
Yeah. So I only know what I read in the newspaper on that one. I try not to read these things.
Kevin, it was for geological hazards.
Oh, okay.
100-year floodplain
Oh.
and a 500-year floodplain.
Okay.
Right next to the creek.
Yeah,
Water
okay.
overlay.
Okay.
It was for a traffic study that was done what they considered improperly.
See, I told you I didn't know.
Because it's a traffic
Yeah.
study and the fact that they closed the St. Elmo Bridge between Nevada and Cascade, it's not an egress site, so it was also for evacuation and public safety.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Angela knows.
But the newspaper did say evacuation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They did say that, but so did Angela. Angela said so. At least I was partially right. Yeah, and so there may be technical issues with that one that I just am not aware of. But like I said, if it becomes a subjective decision on the part of the city council to say there's not enough traffic or too much traffic, the courts are very rarely will overturn something like that. The developer's looking to develop the specific use. City and county staff look at projects from a policy and a criteria standpoint. And the neighborhood looks at it from a lot of different perspectives, but it's oftentimes a more subjective and emotional standpoint. It's where they've invested their money, and now they feel like their investment is going to be challenged or maybe impacted negatively. Or they don't like they've lost their view, or it's looming over their house, or whatever other sorts of things that folks can get involved in. And absolutely legitimate concerns. They just don't always work in terms of how the developer then has the opportunity to change his plans around. Usually it's I don't like it, get it out of here. And it becomes that kind of fight. And that like I talked about, that fight usually doesn't end well. It ends with city council making some decision and somebody filing a lawsuit. So there's a lot of, and Kono should be thanked for classes like this and opportunities like this, because it gives people the opportunity to think a little bit more broadly about what it is that's happening here. That doesn't happen often in neighborhood settings, and I've done neighborhood meetings for 45 years. And what often happens in neighborhoods is that the loudest, most angry people are the ones who drive the day, primarily because their neighbors don't want to fight with them. And even if there are neighbors out there who don't care, or there are neighbors who may like the project or may think it's a good idea or might want to move there, the last thing they're usually going to do is say something. And so these things can become very negative very fast because of that sort of dynamic. Kono, though, has been at the forefront of trying to bring information to these things and get the subjectivity out of it, get some of the emotion out of it, and try to help the city and the developer and the neighborhood make good decisions. And so Sarah and all of her predecessors should be thanked for that. And I've used them a couple of times in projects. One of the projects I did where I thought I was going to have a lot of trouble, and I asked Como for some help with the neighborhood association, was at Union and Fillmore, where the Centura, Fillmore's going east-west there. So it's on the northwest corner, where there's a bunch of little brick medical office buildings. We thought that we would, it used to be a turf farm. And so we thought we would just get our hats handed to us in that project. But through some of Kono's efforts, we talked to the neighborhood, and they actually wanted us to build those kinds of things. And one of the reasons, interestingly enough, which nobody had ever thought of, was that those buildings block the noise from Fillmore and Union and Circle. And so all of that traffic noise used to just flow right across that side, right into that neighborhood. And they said, can't you build more buildings along the edge there, right next to our houses, because it's quieter? And that's always a great story, because I never thought that one. Anyway, so I've been involved in lots of those things. I got my clock cleaned by a neighborhood on the opposite corner where the Audubon campus is. One of my clients was Safeway, and I tried to get a Safeway built there, and got creamed. So anyway, it happens. So sometimes this is places where you can be effective. Zoning actions, yes, you can be effective because it's a change of zone or development plan. You can certainly have a lot of stuff. At master plans, yes, master plans are even larger. So there's a lot of neighborhood plans going on. If you get involved in those kinds of things, you can oftentimes influence what's going to happen to vacant parcels in your neighborhood or some redevelopment parcels in your neighborhood. Development plans, the property is usually already zoned at that point, but you can argue about, like I said, streetlights and parking and landscaping, setbacks. When you get to the final plat, you're pretty much done. Most neighborhoods will not argue about whether the drainage technically flows in the right direction or whether it's supposed to flow uphill or whatever. It's pretty much done at that point. So most developers are willing to listen and make reasonable compromises, but you have to remember they've got a price of the land, and that guy probably isn't going to sell his property for less. And so you got to figure they've got to protect their bottom line, so they can't go below something that gives them some sort of profit motive. What they can do to make this stuff better: heights, buffer, density. Focus on what can be changed to make the development a better neighbor. And that's on both sides of that equation. You can't just be a developer and say, I'm going to do it, and I don't care where the lights are, because City Council will not approve that. City Council wants to know that you've tried to make your best efforts to try and at least fit yourself into the neighborhood. Angela?
What about when developments come in for fire and police, where they say they're going to put in a substation? Can neighbors get involved with that if it doesn't happen?
Can they get involved with that? Oh, sure. I mean, if the developer in that case is the city, and I think the city sometimes can be the worst developer. Because they don't have to change their mind if they don't want to. You get that situation out here on Union and Austin Bluffs, where the city utilities wants to put that big substation.
The water station that's 20 feet too high?
Well, that's a whole other story. Yeah.
Well,
oops. That's an oops
they're just gonna
moment.
amend it and say,
Yeah. Can you imagine a developer doing that? That would not have gone over big. But the city is a developer too. Not that often, and they usually will bend over backwards to try and make sure that they're fitting themselves into the neighborhood correctly. Let's go. We've kind of already done all this. What happens once the process is finished? That's when the developer builds all this stuff. Moves the dirt, builds the parking lots. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the most favorite issues from a year ago. About a year ago is when this whole thing hit the fan, right? So how much water is in an acre foot? Anybody know? How many gallons? 328,000 gallons. Or 26. 28. I think it's 20. 328,000. How many homes does 1 acre foot of water serve? Generally, single family equivalents, it's usually like 3 or 3.5. It's getting better though. One of the interesting pieces, and it says this down here, City of Colorado Springs uses the same amount of water today as it did in the 1980s. And so in the 1980s it was 2 dwelling units per acre foot. Now it's 3, heading for 4, and ought to be able to get to 5 or 6. Las Vegas, I think, is at 12 or 15 is what they can support on an acre foot. So there's a lot of improvement that can be done there from a water perspective and a conservation perspective. But water is an important issue, obviously, and it was a major issue in the last mayor's election, and it just continues to be always a question. But it seems to me like this Colorado Springs Utilities has done a fabulous job of figuring out how to make their water more effective, to use it more effectively, how to convince you all to use it more effectively. And we literally have doubled the population and use the same amount of water. And I heard that same statistic in a piece. We use renewable water, and so that's why it becomes an argument, especially when the Colorado River is drying up and there's pressure on that, and we get a lot of our water. 70 to 80% of our water comes from the Colorado River, and so those are big issues. Yes, ma'am.
And why are we not using groundwater?
It's just been a decision by Colorado Springs Utilities to just not do it. So we use groundwater in the county. If you live in the county, if you're in Falcon, or any place out east, Monument, Glen Eagle, all of those developments are on groundwater. But everything in the city of Colorado Springs is not on groundwater. There may be a well here or there, but there's certainly not potable water that the city of Colorado Springs is mining out of the ground for that. And that's always been sort of like the secret backup. If we really start having a problem, we can mine that water. There's no recharge of that, so every drop you take out, you better use it effectively because it's not going back in. But but there's still a lot of groundwater out there. I think Colorado Springs is in better shape water-wise than a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the concern and fear that residents have about water. So I think we're doing better than we think. Doesn't mean it's not important though. It's critical. It's of critical importance. Yes, sir.
Sorry, what's that time period? So it serves, what is it?
In the 80s.
About 3.5 homes
Oh,
per year?
yeah, it's 3.5 acres. 3.5 homes will be supported by 1 acre foot a year, per year.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I was wondering.
How many acre feet does the city need to serve the total current residents? It's 72,000. And they have reliable water of up to 95,000. So there's a gap in there between the two. And everybody likes to have the gap because you never know what's going to happen with Colorado River or droughts or whatever. But that's what the whole argument was about a year ago, is how much of that gap should we eat into for new annexations. So it was pretty contentious, pretty argumentative. HBA was not a fun place to be around during those arguments. Yes, ma'am.
What do you mean by the phrase acre foot of water?
Yeah, so that's 1 acre, 1 foot deep. So it's about a football field is about an acre, and you would have 1 foot of water in that. So it's at 1 acre filled to 1 foot. And so you got big reservoirs that can store hundreds of thousands of acre feet, Cheeseman and those kinds of big reservoirs. Not Cheeseman. Cheeseman? No. Some of the big ones up in Dillon is a good one. Hundreds of thousands of acre feet of water are stored there. So we're a beautiful city. We've been growing at about 1.5% per year, actually growing slower in the last couple of years than what people perceive and what they think. Primarily, I think, because of the affordability of housing. And in fact, I saw that Colorado is one of the top 5 states in the United States for out-migration. People just simply can't afford a house here. And in some ways that some people like that idea, but not me. I think it's a bad idea. And I'd like to have my kids move back here and have everybody's kids have the opportunity to move back here and have a future and be able to buy a house and sort of get started on the American dream. And I think we're losing that opportunity quickly. How we grow matters. Are we growing with more water? Are we growing with higher density? The comprehensive plan of Colorado Springs has a lot of language in it about increasing density. And a lot of the builders are coming up with products that have much higher density, much lower water use. A lot of the codes of the state and the city are requiring less water use, less electrical use, those kinds of energy codes. So there's a lot of things that go into that. But building a house today is way more expensive than building it 20 years ago or 50 years ago, for sure. But how we grow is really important. We've got 25,000 acres sitting out there on the east side of town, mostly owned by one developer. And how that develops is really how the future of Colorado Springs is going to go. Do we want more multifamily? Do we want higher density? Or do we want to squeeze our city in together a little bit more and have these contentious arguments all the time? Where you got high density trying to fit into office sites that neighbors don't want anymore. And that's that Royal Pines, for example. And are we going to develop? Are we going to annex? Are we going to just sit pat with the land we've got? Because there's a lot of raw land out there that we already have. But like we talked about, it's mostly in one developer's hands. And I think we run the risk of, having some problems with that in the future if we don't annex more. But annexation then dedicates water. You got the water problem and the question of where and who pays for what. And so it's the growth questions have not gone away in the 45 years I've been here. They've been, when I annexed the Northgate project, it was thought to be way out there. And it was a flagpole annexation, just like we're talking about nowadays. And here it is now, filled in on all four sides, and having the infill questions and arguments and lawsuits. So, does development pay its way? That's a common question. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just was wondering if you could speak more to the annexation process and from a developer's perspective.
Mm-hmm. So the annexation, for those of you who don't know, is how you take a raw piece of land that hasn't developed or maybe is developed but mostly not, and you annex it to the city and therefore have access to all the city utilities, city police and fire protection, parks, and all those kinds of things. And so it's where you decide to develop. So there's a lot of development in the county that's occurred outside of annexation. My own opinion is that we ought to annex more to have more control over what's happening out there, because those developments out there in eastern El Paso County are going to run out of water. Not so much run out of water as they're going to run out of inexpensive water. And it's just going to get more and more and more expensive to provide water out there. And so I'm in favor of annexation. The developers look at that and basically look at it and say, what are my costs? How do I figure out how to get this property in a reasonable time into a development state? And that's where annexation to the city can be advantageous, because if you can pull utilities out there, you don't have to worry about the water. The water is going to be there. You know what the rules are. Everybody knows how to develop in the city. And so I think developing in the city is much better than developing in the county, even though I represent a number of water districts and others out there in the county. And it's a valuable way to do development. It's just, I don't think it's the right way for us to do that over the long haul. So the annexation decision is basically one, you ask the city, hey, I'd like to come and be in the city. What do you want from me? The city says, well, we need to have, this road needs to be extended, you have to pay for that. And this utility needs to be extended, you have to pay for that. We want parks that have this, and we have this, and we want this kind of density, and we want you to build this. And so the city negotiates basically an annexation agreement with the developer And the developer then decides, boy, I can't afford to do that. I'm either not going to buy the property or I'll develop it in the county. And then the annexation occurs, then the development occurs inside the city limits. Yes, sir.
How often can the city annex against the owner's wishes?
In certain circumstances, they can. If the city surrounds it on 100%, they can annex that. If you have several property owners, numerous property owners, and the city has 2/3 contiguity, they can force a vote to be annexed to the city, and then they have a vote, and the property owners vote, and you can annex that. City of Colorado Springs does not do that, but some places do. But most of the time, it's instigated by the property owner to annex to the city. It's not very often that the city instigates an annexation. Yes, ma'am.
Oh,
You gonna say something?
To me, an annex is just like in a building or in the annex. If you're in the annex, you say nothing. You have no say. When you're in the annex.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm following you.
Well, in a building, like
Yeah.
when people sit inside
This
the
is
annex.
this is kind of an annex, yeah.
Well, this isn't. An annex would be like another little room where people
Yeah.
are looking at us.
Yep, it's an expansion of the existing boundary for sure.
So when I went to get my votes, no one in the annex part of Colorado Springs could sign my petition. Their votes did not count.
Really?
Because they're not
Really?
part of the city.
Are they not part of the city yet?
No.
Okay. Well, if they're not part of the city, then that wouldn't help you. So yeah. Okay. Okay.
They have no say.
Yeah. So I never got to this. Developers pay its own way. Basically, a Western United States concept of how cities grow. So the fundamental piece of this, and it gets very complicated in a lot of settings, but it's that the developers in an annexation area or a new development area pay for all the capital expenses. So they pay for all the roads, they pay for all the utilities, they pay for all the stormwater drainage, they pay for all the pipes, all the extensions of utilities, sidewalks, all that stuff is paid for by the developer, ultimately by the future homeowner, because developers don't do this for nothing. So the future property owner actually pays for all of that. And then the grand bargain is that we'll build it, you take care of it. So they'll give the parks to the city, they'll give the roads to the city, and there's rules and regs about, you can't just build a crappy road and give it to the city and they'll take it. There's time frames and warranties and all that kind of stuff. So there's all kinds of rules around that. But that's the basic fundamental piece. The capital infrastructure is built primarily by the developer or the builder or the current resident. And the city then takes the maintenance of all of these things. That's mostly what it does. Special districts come into play on that because special districts can borrow money at a cheaper rate than a developer can. And so a lot of new development, in fact, I would say 95% of new development has a special district on top of it, a metro district. And they sell bonds to the market at, used to be 3.5%, 4%. Now we just closed a bond issue today at 6.5%. And so it's a difficult market, but it's still cheaper than the developer can buy it. And all things being equal, that should translate into a lower cost of the house. Doesn't always, but that's the basic fundamental theory behind that. Any questions about does development pay its own way? I think the Western United States has kind of built it that way. Colorado Springs has certainly done that. There's still a couple things, I think, like parks that are often paid for by the city. But even in all the new annexations, basically the developer has to pay for parks. And so most of that capital expense is borne by the people who actually live there.
So that's why we were saying last week that they were not carrying their own weight because they get loans, they get grants. We were just talking about this last week.
Uh-huh. Well, they certainly get loans,
And grants.
and I don't know about grants. I've not heard, they get some, I guess.
The grants were
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Still,
Yeah, and
They put up a lot of the capital.
yeah, it's a capital expensive business for sure. Takes a long time. And, you know, for example, there's a development, Flying Horse Ranch. It's just being turned over. There's like $30 million that was spent by the developers in the first 10 years of that development. And they didn't go to the market for that bond. They've just recently gone to the market. Now they're getting in all kinds of trouble for that. But it's, you know, all things, like I said, all things being equal, competition, as long as there's competition amongst, you know, lots of different development, that public financing, that municipal financing can reduce cost in housing. So developers aren't all that bad. Some of us are okay. Some of us are your neighbors. Some of us buy coffee from your kids at the Starbucks. Development isn't just about making money. It's a but it is a prerequisite in a private market economy. 95% of those houses are built and they live in a marketplace. So the marketplace is always trying to make money. I always give the example is you know who's the biggest beneficiary of this affordable housing crisis? All of us. All of us who own houses already. Because my 401k looks a boatload better when I put my house in it, and but it's not looking a boatload better when I have to drive to St. Louis in order to visit my kids. So I mean, it's something to think about. We're at 65% home ownership. When I moved here in 1979, we were at 69%. So it's going down in terms of the ability to own a house. And it's even worse than that in a lot of the other places, and almost impossible to own a house in the mountain communities, Vail and Aspen and others. So, you know, developers create economic opportunities for people to be able to stay in their neighborhoods and participate and grow with the community. So there's change. Developers facilitate change. So we're not, you know, we do perform a function, and there are rules and regs, and we don't always kill the good guy in the Perry Mason show, even though that's what my wife says. Housing affordability is a critical need. We've talked a little bit about it. Private developers and the builders who are building the houses, and all the new houses that are being built are not affordable by even the average homeowner or average household. But the more of those that we build, the less pressure there is for all of the other housing to increase its price. And so if we can build more houses, even at that higher level, we'll be able to sort of moderate the price increases at all levels. Because they all exist in a marketplace. And so it's hard to think that, because when we talk about affordable housing and you go to the parade of homes and the average parade of homes is $825,000, doesn't seem like we're building for affordability. But all those new houses help to take up some of the demand, and that demand, if we can get more houses on the market, we can moderate that demand. And hopefully that'll keep our housing prices lower. It's not lost on people that Colorado Springs' average housing price is $125,000, maybe even more than Denver's. And part of that is because we have local builders, we have lots of land, we have utilities, we've had a pro-growth attitude, and it, as bad as it seems in Colorado Springs, it's worse in almost every other major city in the United States. So it's a problem all over the place. We have a lot of different folks. We've been working with the Community Housing Affordability Task Force called CHAT. They've established a Pikes Peak Housing Network, and that's trying to figure out how to get not the subsidized housing and not the high-end housing, but that kind of in the middle. Can we build houses so that those folks in the middle can actually afford that? And a lot of that has to do with rentals. And we built 9,000 units, building 9,000 units this past year, and another 9,000 coming. So there's going to be a lot of apartment units on the market, which will help moderate rental prices. I think you'll see rentals in the next year or two respond to that supply problem. There'll be moderation in increased vacancy rates and moderation in rent increases. Homeowners American Dream, we always talk about that. It can't be, I'm not allowed to speak for the HBA unless I say that. So it's part and parcel of what the HBA tries to do. So anyway, tried to put a little face and a little information about what the developers do, why they do it, answered a few other questions along the way. So I hope you can either have some more questions or at least you've learned something tonight. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Any questions?
Yes, sir.
So in regards to when they come up with a community plan, and obviously they see they're very forward thinking, most of the developers have a lot of data and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
When they prepare for the growth, are they under preparing for the infrastructure and participating in building fire stations and schools and, or as I'm asking, in my neighborhood, grew pretty fast on the northeast side, and the school's busting out the seams. So are they looking at that, and do they build that first, or do they wait for the tax revenue to pay for that, and kind of back and forth? How does that?
It's a little bit of both. Sorry.
Can you repeat the question for the audience?
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I know.
I wasn't paying that. I'm not sure I paid that close attention. So the question is, do the developers, as they're working to build new neighborhoods, are they helping to finance schools, finance fire stations, and other infrastructure? Are they planning for that? Generally, yes. If you have an annexation agreement, some of the annexation agreements require developers to actually build fire stations. The timing, you don't always build a fire station at the beginning because you don't want people sitting out there with no fires or no people to worry about. So they're usually a later sort of thing. A lot of what happens is the developers are paying fees, and so the fees are being collected by the city, and the city is using that money to build the next fire station. And so there's a lot of different public finance ways to do that. It's not just city infrastructure, though, so police stations, fire stations. There is a fee that all new development has to pay for that kind of thing, as well as these annexation agreements. Schools are a different matter. Schools are the responsibility of the school districts, and that is a problem in Colorado, I think. The developers have tried to develop some ideas about how to build schools, but basically the financing for schools needs to come from the school districts. And those are your biggest property taxes, usually are schools, and most of that's being used to build schools and pay for the bonds that built schools. We haven't had that big a problem as much in the recent past. District 49 struggled with that for about 20 years ago in a miserable way. And the developers basically had to step up and do some different things. But the charter schools and those kinds of things have really alleviated some of the pressure on some of the public school districts for that. But public schools are still a bit of a dicey matter in growing places. Yes, sir.
Is it not typical for the developer to actually set aside land that would be donated?
Yeah, city is required. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the city is required to set aside land for schools and parks. And in negotiated ways, they're required to set aside land for fire stations and other sort of amenities. But yeah, there is a law in the books that says you got to, for every 1,000 people, you got to dedicate this much square footage for parks and this much square footage for per unit that you build, that much for schools. So the land is set aside. Right. It's the capital to build the school and the park that are really the more difficult piece. Yes, ma'am.
For the Pikes Peak Housing Network and the Community Housing Affordability Task Force, how many buildings do you know of in Colorado Springs that we have here? Are there enough? Do you think there are enough? Or should there be more of them?
No, I think there needs.
TESA and Partners in Housing.
Yeah, so the question is, are there enough buildings? to meet the housing for the community and using the Pikes Peak housing network. That they're really just advocates for housing. They don't own housing, they don't build housing. So like I said, most of the housing is being built by the private sector. We're catching up. I can say that those 9,000 apartment units that are getting built will make a dent in people's rents as we go forward. But in the on the for sale housing side, not nearly as much. We're falling farther behind in the for housing stuff. And I think if we're not at 60% home ownership in the next 10 years, I'd be surprised. So I think we're turning into more of a society for rentals and less for home ownership. And I'm not sure what that means for our society, but it's different. It'll be different.
Do you think that's
Yes,
true
ma'am.
across the country?
It is. It is. And I think it's true across the country because everybody's suffering from this affordable housing crisis, and nobody has quite figured out how to make that problem go away, because all the local governments, hold that land use approval process and building codes and all those kinds of things very close to their hearts, but it could be solved if we could find a way to shorten that review time, that 2 years, if not to reduce the quality of the road or any of that kind of thing, but to shorten the time frame, get the lots built so that builders can build houses. We can make a dent, and I think we have made a dent. Like I said, the difference between Denver, which is a miserable market for buying a house, and Colorado Springs is $125,000. So it's a good-sized difference in terms of the cost of housing. Yes, sir. I got my back. You guys could throw something at me if I'm not answering your question. Yes, sir.
So with Colorado Springs, obviously with a lot of the industry, it's kind of a two-parter. I'll probably just hit on the one. So
Oh God, it's a two-parter. I have to repeat a two-parter.
A lot of our industry, obviously, we have a very heavy military presence, so with the presence of Space Force becoming more of a permanent fixture. Obviously, those jobs are really, really high paying, which is great, right? We need a lot of those, some of the tech sector, we were at that other place, a lot of the cybersecurity, a lot of tech, period, that brings a lot of high paying jobs. Does that have a lot to do with a lot of how our home prices? Because those people can obviously afford whatever they want.
Sure.
I mean, is there a plan? I mean, and who knows if this is even a question for you, but more of a, I don't know, I was talking with a lady last time about, I don't want to put them in a middle class type of job setting, but we certainly have the engineers of the world and a lot of professionals, but we also have some families still working entry level jobs. I mean, does that have still a lot to do with getting some of those jobs to be able to have those middle ground housing? I mean,
Yeah. So the question is, what is the new growth with higher paying jobs? How is that impacting the housing market? How is that impacting our growth, our whole growth scenario? Always an interesting question, always a difficult question. Everybody wants higher paying jobs, right? Because you want your kids to have higher paying jobs, and I don't want them to work at Starbucks all the time. But you still got to have those people. People have to clean their houses, and people have to, we have to do retail. We have to work at the shopping centers. We've got to do all those kinds of things. So growing a community there's no magic to that. You try to attract higher paying jobs, which hopefully will increase other people's wages, which then can help them afford a house or a rent or whatever. And so the thing just goes in a constant churn. And it's been like that since I've been here in 1979. And so there's no exact answer, but it's the whole economic development argument, right? Is if we just get high paying jobs, they'll just pay more for the houses. We'll never be able to afford our houses. And it just is a problem. So I don't have a magic bullet. You need to have Jonna Reeder Claymeyer come, because she's better at that question than I am.
She actually just spoke to this at their gala
Oh,
on
yeah?
Saturday night.
Yeah.
About some of the economic development
Mhm.
naysayers
Yeah.
from like the 70s, and how there was a lot of pushback to economic growth in our community. And I was talking with one of our members tonight about I think that's a reason why people do push back about economic growth, because then you start to look at these high-paying jobs that come in, and you say, well, I'm getting forced out of my own community.
Yep, I can't afford the rent anymore.
Yeah, and then you're going to build all these high-rises that take away from the beautification of our landscape or
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, free enterprise is a messy way to build cities, but there's no other better way. I mean, it's like the old Winston Churchill, right? It's the worst way to build a city except for all the others.
Yeah. Angela?
We did some research on that with the military. When you talk about straight military members, not their civilian counterparts, they actually can't afford market rate apartments that we have in this community. Their substance that they get or sustenance that they get doesn't cover it. About 10 years ago, we had a big increase because Colorado Springs was starting to get very expensive to live. It was one of those places where everything that the military doesn't have, Colorado Springs has, because it's so beautiful in the environment. But yeah, they can't afford market rate apartments.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's called BAH,
Yeah.
and it's about $1,500.
It depends on your rank,
Yes.
and size of your family, but they can't afford market rate, and that's been the question. And with Creek Walk, when the gentleman came in and said he was really gonna try to make it military friendly, it was, the prices are gonna just be too high, so they have to supplement, and that's an issue.
But even I saw, that BAH at $1,500, and then not be able to find a 2-bedroom apartment that was less than that, because the apartment complexes knew they could get that much.
Yes.
Because the BAH was gonna pay it, right?
Yeah,
Have you heard the term Silicon Mountain?
I have.
What do you
We
think
were
about
supposed to
that?
be Silicon Mountain in the 70s, and then in the 80s, and then in the 90s, and now
Instead of Silicon
in the
Valley,
20s.
There's we coined the phrase Silicon Mountain because we did get a lot of those jobs
Mhm.
that you were speaking of coming here.
Yeah, obviously high tech stuff comes and goes. There was a lot of people in the dot-com bust in 2000, which was one of those recessions that I lived through in the housing market. And so, economies are just hard. They're just hard to figure out. We have traditionally had lower priced land, lower priced utilities, lower priced housing, and so we could attract some of those in the 80s when we had MCI and all those buildings out there, and then in the 90s they were all empty, and then in the 2000s they were filled up again, and then they're empty again, and so it's a dynamic piece. But I can tell you, Colorado Springs does as good a job as any in terms of balancing all of that kind of stuff out. I mean, I'm a Colorado Springs guy through and through, so it's a great place to live, and I appreciate all of you taking an interest in how it grows. Yes, ma'am.
A question about the planning process, and so like take Creek Walk for example. When people are getting the green postcards and they have a chance to give feedback, and the developer has the site plan finished, you have to say what kind of businesses will be in that shopping center, or is it just it's a shopping center? Or do you have to say like it's going to be a Fuzzy's Taco and a Woo Woo Lemon? Or
No, you just have to say it's just retail or it's just a shopping center. They don't go to that level of detail to say only Fuzzies can be there. And so you can say at the beginning, I've got a lease with Fuzzies and I've got a lease with Wendy's, but there's no strict requirement that you have to have that kind of thing in the zoning process.
And so if that impacts like the feel of the neighborhood, so say if that's like Ivy Wild neighborhood who are like, what if they want more of a local small business feel, and then that comes in and it's all corporate chains, like how do we as citizens, as neighbors, like we have any control of that, any input? It's just
Almost none. I mean, if you can figure that one out, you let me know. It's still a private property rights oriented community, and the fewer restrictions the private property owner has, the more he thinks his property's worth. And so I think that ebb and flow of nationals versus locals and walkable versus driving and all those kinds of things are just difficult. They're just difficult to manage in this kind of process where you have private property rights and you're trying to figure out how to grow a city. Most places that manages at double and triple the rents. And so you can manage it if you're paying $50 a foot for a piece of property. People pay more attention to you about that. But when you're paying 10 and 20, it's just difficult. It's difficult to see returns like that. So Irvine, California, and places like that can control that a lot more. But that's just because the values of their property are so high.
Isn't Aspen an example of? I think there are no corporate hotels, at least with corporate badges.
Yeah. No, that's probably true.
And very little, if any, franchise restaurants, fast food.
Yeah, most of that is pressure. Probably private pressure on the property owner to not do it that way.
Okay, not city.
I think the city subsidizes the local stores to keep them in business.
Do they?
That's what we had read. Yeah, my husband was telling me he read that. Yeah.
Been a long time since I've been to Aspen.
So it's intentional.
Yeah.
And I think I know a local developer here who I think she decided to become a developer to try to make decisions that she thought were wise for the private land available around.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about. And having a very difficult time getting her next building out of the ground because of cost increases.
Yeah, it's the same person.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the construction cost increase.
Yeah, it's not a fun business. It keeps you up nights, for sure.
What percentage of developers are women?
Oh, not very many. Not very many. There's one right there. Janie, what's that? Oh, how many developers are women? What percentage of developers are women?
That's the answer.
No, it's not zero. Do any of you remember Janie Richardson? Do you remember Janie Richardson? She was a hot developer for a long time, and then crashed and burned like every other developer most of the time. But Sunflower, yeah. So she was a big deal for a while. But it's mostly a guy's world, I guess. Sorry about that.
Why do you think that is?
Oh God, don't. That's for a whole nother. I am not. I need a sociology degree for that one. No, I don't know. It's just, there was a. So I was listening to something the other night, just to give you a little hint. The woman who just won the Nobel Prize for economics because she was a Harvard professor that described the women's age or wage gap and what causes all of that. And I've heard her talk, and she talked about that, almost that very issue, that there are gender type professions that, most nurses are women, most doctors are men. And she was talking about that from an economic study standpoint. So I suggest you talk to her, because I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, it seems maybe this is getting off track.
Yeah.
One final question. So, Housing and Building Associations, so HBA,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of organizations are part of that, and who gets into leadership roles into that organization?
Yeah, so it's about 25% builders, so it's about 120 builders in that. So it's mostly the builders. But then there's all the other service industries, the title companies, the realtors, the plumbers, and the lumber supply companies, and people like me who manage metro districts. So I used to be in the building industry, but now I'm not. Now I manage metro districts, but so I'm a member, but not a builder member.
Got it. And are there events that the public could go to that?
Well, the Parade of Homes. The Parade of Homes is the biggest one,
Okay.
and they coordinate that. And the other kinds of things are mostly for members. Nothing comes to mind in terms of public kind of things.
And what about sessions where you guys meet on a regular basis? Is the public open to those?
Yeah. Oh, heck no. We never allow the public. It's in the proverbial smoke-filled rooms.
Yes. Okay.
No. No, they're most of the time it's for members only, but we advocate. You hear us all the time. You'll hear me next week speaking at the utilities board or city council about this, that, and the other. So it's not, HBA has never been a shy organization about representing its interests. But in terms of it being a public organization, it's not. It's a members organization. It's a trade association.
Right. And as our dinner sponsor tonight, why do you think HBA is invested in a program like Kona?
Because it takes all these kinds of efforts to build a great community. And I wouldn't be involved with HBA if they weren't involved with organizations like that. The Careers in Construction, the HBA Cares, the housing network, and all of those kinds of things. It's not just builders who build communities, it's everybody. And it's critical that we have a healthy economy and a healthy discussion about where we're going in the future. So it's always been an ethic of the HBA to do that, even though there are times when you probably think that's not the case.
Very good. All right. Well, give them a round of applause.